Let me tell you about a Saturday morning in Roswell, New Mexico, in November of 1986, when an old rancher named Halden Vesper walked into the Chaves County Stockmen's Bank with $11 in his checking account and asked the new branch manager for a loan of $5,000. The new manager looked at him for about 4 seconds. He looked at the cracked leather of his boots, dusty with the pale caliche dust that gets on a man's clothes when he has driven 7 miles of ranch road before sunrise. He looked at the patched elbow of his wool coat, twice mended with a darker patch of wool sewn on by a hand that had been gone for 2 years. He looked at the gray stubble on his jaw, the worn brim of the work cap he had taken off and was holding in both hands in front of him, and the weather sitting in the deep lines around his pale blue eyes. Then he looked at the number on the screen, $11.31 in checking, $409 in savings. No credit cards under that profile, no investment accounts. Just an old man in a small town asking for money he plainly didn't have the means to pay back. The new manager said no. He said it kindly enough, the way a person says no when they have already decided the conversation isn't worth their attention. He used the kind of phrases they teach in the management programs in the cities. Based on what I'm seeing on my end, sir, I just don't see a path to approval at this time. He suggested a county program for seniors. He said something about a partnership with the Agricultural Extension Office. He straightened a pen on his desk. He glanced at his next file. The whole exchange took less than 3 minutes, beginning to end. He did not ask Halden Vesper how long he had been with the bank. He did not ask whether there were other accounts under his name. He did not ask the head teller standing 15 feet away, who had known the family for 34 years, anything at all. Halden Vesper nodded once. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward in the chair. He set both hands on the chrome armrests and pushed himself up. His right knee popped softly, the way it had popped every time he stood up out of a chair since 1979, when a horse had rolled on him in a holding chute and broken something he never had set properly. He thanked the new manager for his time. He walked out of the office, across the dark blue carpet, past the rope stanchions that nobody in Roswell ever needed, and stopped at the front counter where the head teller stood waiting. Her name was Wynne Castellanos. She had worked at that bank for 34 years. She had known Halden's wife Mira for almost all of them. She had been watching the conversation through the glass wall of the office, and her jaw had been tight the whole time. Halden leaned on the counter and lowered his voice. He asked her to pull up his other account, the one in the trust. Wynne looked at him for a moment, and something tightened in her face. Then she turned to her keyboard and typed an account number she had known by heart since 1973. The screen changed. She didn't gasp. She didn't show anything on her face at all. She just turned the monitor slowly, deliberately, not toward Halden, but toward the glass-walled office in the back, where the new manager was already typing on his next loan file. What appeared on that screen was a number nobody in Roswell could have guessed sat in the bank under the name of the quiet old rancher who drove a 1972 Chevrolet flatbed and ate the same egg breakfast at the same cafe every Saturday morning for 16 years. A number that would, by the end of the week, travel through every pew at the First Baptist Church, through every booth at the Dunes Cafe, through every front porch on Main Street, and out into the surrounding country until it reached as far as the old men sitting on the bench in front of the feed store in Hagerman, 20 miles south, $8,743,206. The new manager looked up from his next file because he had felt something, the way a person sometimes feels someone standing behind him in a room. He looked at the monitor that had been turned toward his office, and his eyes settled on the number, and the blood went out of his face. He stood up. His mouth opened. He did not speak. He just stood there in the doorway of his office, one hand still resting on the back of his chair, looking at a number he had not bothered to find half an hour earlier, when it would have made all the difference in the world. But that's not what this story is really about. That number is just the moment everything visible to the rest of the town turned and pointed in a new direction. What this story is about is what brought a 73-year-old man into that bank on a cold November morning with $11 in his pocket and a silver watch he had carried every single day for 2 years. What this story is about is a promise made in a hospital room 2 years before, and the shape of grief in the cab of an old pickup truck. And what a man does when the woman who knew him better than he knew himself has been gone long enough that he has stopped expecting to hear her voice from the kitchen and started expecting only the silence, To understand all of that, you have to back up to a few hours before he walked into the office of a man who didn't see him. You have to understand who Halden Vesper was, what he had lost, and what he had promised. You have to understand a marriage that ran 56 years through 2 droughts, 3 good cattle years out of every 10. The slow building of a quiet fortune in a trust account that nobody outside the marriage knew existed, and the long patient work of keeping a man and a piece of land alive in country that does not love either one. So let me take you back to the morning of that same Saturday, when the air over the Pecos River Valley smelled like cold sage and wood smoke, and the first thin scrim of frost on the alfalfa stubble, and an old rancher climbed into his pickup at 6 in the morning and started the long, slow drive into town. He had done this every Saturday since Mira died. Some habits a person doesn't break, because breaking them feels too much like agreeing she's really gone. Educational note. In the 1980s, small-town American banks in the Southwest still operated largely on personal relationships rather than data systems. Account information was distributed across multiple terminals and ledgers, and many longtime customers held trust accounts and operating accounts under separate profiles that newer staff members transferred in from urban branches often never consulted unless someone specifically asked. The result was a recurring blind spot. Branch managers in their 30s, accustomed to credit scores and digital risk scoring, sometimes failed to recognize wealth that was simply held quietly under a different file. Part 2. Mira's Seat. The truck was a 1972 Chevrolet C2 O flatbed, faded from the original deep blue to something closer to the color of dust on a summer evening. The driver's side door had a sticky hinge that needed a particular kind of upward lift before it would open. The radio worked only on the AM band, and only sometimes, and even then it picked up nothing but the country station out of Carlsbad and the agricultural report out of Lubbock that came on at 5 in the morning. Halden Vesper climbed in, settled his right knee carefully under the steering column, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice and started. It had started that way every morning for 14 years. It had occurred to him once or twice that he should probably replace the truck. He had decided each time that the truck was not the thing that needed replacing. The passenger seat had a permanent dip in the cushion. It was where Mira had sat for 38 years, riding into town with him for Saturday errands, reading the newspaper aloud while he drove, turning pages with her thumb. She used to angle the side mirror toward the cab so she could check her hair before they got to the cafe, and then she would forget to angle it back. Halden had never readjusted that mirror. Some mornings he would glance at it and see nothing but the road behind him, and the absence of her face in the glass would settle in his chest like cold water sliding down a pane. He had learned to live with it. He had also learned that learning to live with a thing was not the same as the thing going away. He drove out the long ranch road, 2 miles of bladed caliche between mesquite and creosote, the headlights pushing through the last of the night, and turned south onto US 285. The sun was just coming up over the eastern flats. The sky was the deep, clean blue you only get in the high desert in November, when the heat is gone, and the dust has settled, and the air is so clear you can see the Capitan Range floating 50 miles to the west. He drove slowly. He had driven this road 3,000 times. He didn't need to think about it. He thought about Mira. He thought about her the way he had thought about her every morning for 2 years. Not the big, dramatic ache that people imagine grief to be, but the small one. The empty side of the bed. The coffee cup she used to use, still in the cabinet, still washed and stacked, that he hadn't put away because moving it would have meant something he wasn't ready to mean. The silver pocket watch in his shirt pocket. He had carried it every day since the morning he came home from the hospital alone. The watch had been a present from him to her. The year they married, 1948. He had paid for it with the proceeds of a steer he raised himself and sold at the Roswell stockyards. On the back, he had asked the engraver to put the words, "To Mira, time is patience." She had laughed when she read it. She had told him he had no business writing poetry. But she had carried that watch every day for 56 years, and when she went into the hospital the last time, she had taken it out of her pocket and put it into his hand and closed his fingers around it. She had said, "You carry it for me now." So he did. He pulled into the parking lot in front of the Dunes Cafe at 12 minutes after 6. The lot was almost empty. A delivery truck idling. 2 ranch trucks parked at the side, the morning still pale and quiet. The bell above the cafe door jangled when he stepped inside. Lorna was behind the counter. She had run the dunes since 1971, when her husband Thomas had bought the place a year before he died. "Morning, Halden." "Morning, Lorna." She had his coffee on the counter before he sat down. Black. No sugar. He took the third stool from the end. The vinyl on the seat had cracked years ago, and the padding had gone flat, but it was his stool. Nobody in Roswell sat there on a Saturday morning. Everybody knew. She brought him his eggs without asking. 2 over-easy wheat toast, a small extra portion of hash browns she had never once charged him for. He ate slowly. He watched the street through the window. A pickup passed. A man in a sheepskin coat walked along the sidewalk with a folded newspaper under his arm. The town was waking up the way small western towns wake up on cold mornings, without hurry, but not asleep. Behind him, a couple of men in oil-field coats came in and took the booth in the corner and ordered coffee and the breakfast burrito plate. He recognized one of them. He nodded. The man nodded back. That was the whole of the greeting. "How's the south pasture pump?" Lorna asked, wiping the counter. "Tired." "That windmill?" "The cooling fan. Bearings are going. Going to have to do something about it before winter sets in proper." She nodded. She knew enough about the ranch to know what a stockwater pump meant in November. If the pump failed and the trough froze, you'd be hauling water by hand for 200 head. And a man Halden's age couldn't haul water for 200 head. He would have to call his neighbor Curtis Robles for help. And Curtis was 76 himself and had a bad shoulder from the cattle work he had done in the 70s. The plain math of it was that the pump needed to keep working. "You going to fix it yourself?" "Going to try. Going to need the parts." "Marlin's got cooling fans for those old pumps. Saw a box in the back when I was over there last week." "I know. I'll stop by after the bank." She paused, the rag still on the counter, and looked at him a moment longer than she usually did. "You going to the bank, Halden?" "I am." "Whatever for?" "A small loan." She didn't say anything to that. She set down the coffee pot. She looked at him for a long moment, the way a woman looks at a friend when she is trying to figure out what he is not telling her. Then she nodded once, the way Wynn would nod 2 hours later, and let it pass. He finished his eggs. He left $3 on the counter for a $2 breakfast. He did that every week. Lorna had told him for 16 years that it was too much. He had told her every time that it wasn't enough. The truth was that the year her husband died, Lorna had been 3 months behind on the cafe's lease. And an envelope had appeared one morning under her back door with $8,000 in cash and no note. She had her suspicions about who had left it. She had never asked. Halden had never said. Some things between people in a small town live in the air without ever needing to be spoken. Halden stepped out onto the sidewalk and stood for a moment, looking up the street toward the bank. The morning sun caught the glass front of the building and turned it bright white. He reached into his shirt pocket and touched the silver watch. He could feel the engraving on the back through the cloth of his shirt. He spoke under his breath, the way a man does when his wife has been gone 2 years and the habit of speaking to her hasn't yet finished leaving him. "All right, Mira," he said. "Let's go see what kind of fellow they sent us." Educational note. The Pecos River Valley around Roswell, New Mexico, has been ranched continuously since the 1860s, and the cultural memory of the region is unusually long. By the 1980s, third and fourth generation ranching families still operated land patented by their great-grandparents, and the small-town economy ran on a web of unspoken favors, anonymous kindnesses, and patient reciprocity that bound neighbors across decades. Outsiders transferring in from larger cities often took years to recognize that what looked like simple folksy hospitality was in fact an elaborate moral economy, and that a man's reputation in Chaves County was measured not by his bank balance but by the favors he had quietly done and never claimed credit for. Part 3. The Office. The bank was 3 blocks from the cafe. Halden walked. His right knee had been bothering him since 1979, when a horse had rolled on him in a chute and broken something he never had set properly, but he didn't carry a cane. Mira had told him once in the year before she got sick that the day a man started leaning on a cane was the day he started feeling old. She had said it the way she said most things, plainly, looking right at him. He had figured she was right about that. She had been right about most things. He walked past the post office. He walked past the small drugstore where Mira used to pick up her blood pressure medication. He walked past the lot where the old movie theater had stood until it burned in 1974. The lot still empty. He walked past Frank Holcomb's hardware store, where Frank was out front sweeping the sidewalk. Frank looked up. He raised a hand. Halden raised a hand back. He did not stop. Frank watched him keep walking up the street toward the bank, and a small line formed between his eyebrows because he had known Halden Vesper for 51 years. And Halden Vesper did not walk to the bank on a Saturday morning for no reason. He pushed open the glass door of the Chaves County Stockmen's Bank and stepped inside. The air conditioning was on too high for November. The carpet was a dark blue plush, recently shampooed, that showed the faint marks of his boots as he crossed it. The walls had been repainted since the last time he had been in the building, a beige color he did not recognize and did not particularly like. Behind the counter, Wynne Castellanos saw him from 20 feet away, and her face changed. "Well, look who," she said. Her face opened into a smile, but there was something careful behind it. She had known him for too long to greet him without reading him first. "Haven't seen you in here since August. Haven't needed anything since August. What brings you in today, Halden?" He glanced toward the glass-walled office at the back. A young man in a dark suit sat at the desk, typing on a laptop. Clean-shaven, sharp haircut, the cut of a city wardrobe. "That the new fellow?" Wynne's smile thinned at the edges. "Preston Marlowe. Came down from the Albuquerque branch about 6 weeks ago. He any good?" She looked at him over the top of her bifocals, the chain swinging slightly against her cardigan. She lowered her voice. "He's efficient." Halden nodded. He understood what she wasn't saying. In Wynne's vocabulary, efficient was the word she used for people who didn't yet understand the difference between speed and care. "I'd like to talk to him about a loan." Something flickered behind her eyes. She knew his accounts, all of them. She knew exactly what number sat in the trust she and Mira had built together quarter by quarter for 15 years. She knew what a $5,000 loan request would look like from a man whose everyday profile showed $11 in checking. "Halden," she said carefully. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure." She studied him for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone, pressed a button, and spoke into the handset. "Mr. Marlowe, I have a longtime customer here who would like to discuss a small loan. Halden Vesper. He has been with us 51 years. She hung up the phone. She nodded toward the office. Halden walked across the carpet. He knocked once on the open door. Preston Marlowe looked up from his laptop and stood. He shook Halden's hand across the desk. The handshake was quick, firm, learned from a book. "Mr. Vesper, please, have a seat." Halden lowered himself into the chair. Chrome arms, thin padding, the kind of chair a man buys when he wants the office to look modern. He set his hands on his knees. He took a moment to look around. The office was new in its arrangement. The desk had been moved at some point from the wall to the center of the room, the way they teach in the management courses, so the manager could face the door directly. There was a framed diploma from a university in Albuquerque on the wall, and beside it, a framed photograph of a young woman holding a small boy in a winter coat. On the corner of the desk sat a coffee mug from a hotel chain. The whole arrangement had the feeling of a room a man has set up to remind himself that he is going somewhere else next, that this is only a stop on the way to a larger branch in a larger city, and that the people who come through the door are not the point. He looked across the desk at the young manager, who had already turned back to his laptop and begun typing. "What can I do for you today, sir?" "I need a small loan, $5,000. "Of course. Let me just pull up your account here." Halden watched the young man's eyes move across the screen. A small line formed between his eyebrows. His typing slowed. Halden knew exactly what the screen was showing him. A checking account with $11.31. A savings account with $409. No credit cards on file. No investment accounts on that profile. Just the numbers of a man who looked exactly the way Halden looked sitting in that chair. Old patched coat, worn boots, calloused hands. The weather of 73 New Mexico winters in the lines around his eyes. Halden watched him decide. It happened in about 3 seconds. The young manager's eyes moved across the screen, then dropped to the cuffs of Halden's coat where the wool was worn thin, then went back to the screen, then settled on his keyboard. The decision had been made. Everything that followed was going to be the explanation of a decision already reached. Halden had seen that look before, in different rooms, in different decades, on the faces of feed store clerks and county officials, and a doctor in El Paso who had spoken to Mira like she was hard of hearing. He knew exactly what the next sentence was going to sound like before it came out. Preston leaned back. His voice had cooled by a degree. "And what would the loan be for, Mr. Vesper?" "Cooling fan and radiator for a stock water pump. South Pasture windmill is wearing out." I see. And what would you be offering as collateral? My word. There was a pause. Preston glanced back at the screen. He cleared his throat softly. He folded his hands on the desk in a gesture he had perhaps practiced in front of a mirror. Mr. Vesper, I appreciate your coming in today, but based on what I'm seeing here, your current balances simply don't support a $5,000 unsecured loan. Your checking shows $11. Your savings is $409. And at your age, without a regular income source posted to our system, I'm afraid I just don't see a path to approval. The numbers aren't there. He let that sit for a moment. Then he added more gently, we do partner with a county program for seniors that can sometimes help with farm and ranch equipment expenses. I'd be happy to get you the paperwork. The office went quiet. Halden looked at Preston Marlowe for a long moment. Not with anger, not with hurt, not even with disappointment exactly. He looked at him the way a rancher looks at a length of fence that has been set in the wrong place. Not the fence's fault. It just wasn't where it should be. He waited just long enough that Preston started to look uncomfortable. Thank you for your time, Halden said. He put his hands on the chrome armrests and pushed himself up. His right knee locked for a second before it released. Preston stood too, polite, smooth. If your situation changes, Mr. Vesper, please don't hesitate to come back in. It won't, Halden said quietly. He walked out of the office. He didn't look back. The carpet was thick under his boots. He could feel Preston Marlowe already turning back to his laptop behind him, already reaching for the next file, already moving on. Halden crossed the lobby and stopped at the front counter where Wynne stood waiting. She had been watching the whole thing through the glass. Her mouth was tight. About how I expected, Halden? About how you expected, Wynne. He leaned on the counter and lowered his voice. The bank was nearly empty. One other customer at the far desk filling out a deposit slip. Wynne, pull up my other account. Educational note. Trust accounts in rural American banks during the 1980s were often shielded from frontline staff by privacy protocols originally designed to protect wealthy clients from junior employees with poor discretion. The unintended consequence was a kind of camouflage. Longtime customers with substantial holdings could move through a branch lobby looking exactly like depositors of modest means, and a manager who relied only on the everyday profile screen, without pulling the priority client file flagged in the internal notes, would have no way of knowing the difference. The system rewarded humility and quiet living, and punished the kind of casual judgment that mistook plain clothes for empty pockets. Part 4. The Other Account. Wynne looked at him across the counter. Her expression didn't change, but something in her shoulders shifted, the way a person's shoulders shift when she has been waiting for a particular moment to arrive. And now it has arrived. You sure, Halden? I'm sure. She turned to her keyboard. She did not look at the screen as she typed. She knew the account number by heart, every digit, in the order she had typed it 1,000 times across 15 years of quarterly statements. The screen changed. The cursor blinked twice. The balance posted to the field, $8,743,206.58. Wynne glanced at the screen. Then she looked at Halden. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. She turned the monitor on its swivel. She did not turn it toward Halden. She turned it slowly, with care, toward the glass office at the back of the lobby, toward the desk where Preston Marlowe sat reviewing his next file. For a few long seconds, nothing happened. The bank was quiet. The other customer at the far desk had not looked up. Wynne stood perfectly still behind the counter. Halden stood perfectly still in front of it. Then Preston Marlowe looked up. His eyes drifted to the monitor that had been turned toward his office. His face did not change for a moment. He squinted. He leaned forward in his chair. He looked at the number on the screen. Then he looked at the back of Halden Vesper's wool coat. Then he looked at the screen again. The blood left his face. It happened the way it always happens. Slowly, at first, then all at once. His mouth opened. He stood up. He took one step toward the office door and then stopped, because he didn't know where he was going. He stood there in his doorway with the door half open and one hand still resting on the back of his chair. Halden didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Wynne. His voice was steady and quiet. Wynne, I didn't need the money. I needed to see the man. Wynne's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She just nodded once, the way a person nods when she has been waiting a long time to hear a particular sentence and has finally heard it. I'll be in Monday, Halden said. I need to talk to someone about a transfer, a large one. We're starting the disbursement Mira and I set up before she passed. You want me to set the meeting? Please." He paused. He turned his head slightly toward the office behind him without quite looking at it. "And not him. Not yet." Wynne nodded. She turned the monitor back to its normal angle. She typed a few keys and the screen changed to a different field. The bank moved on around them, the way a bank moves on at 10 in the morning on a Saturday in a small town. Halden tapped the counter once with his knuckle. He walked out of the lobby. The bell above the front door chimed softly behind him. Behind him, Preston Marlowe was still standing in the doorway of his office. He looked at Wynne. Wynne did not look at him. She was already entering deposit information for a customer who had just stepped up to her counter. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had told him on the day he started, 6 weeks earlier, that the priority client flag in the customer notes meant he was to consult her before declining anything from a list of about 40 longtime account holders. He had nodded at the time, and then forgotten about the conversation entirely, because the screen on the everyday profile was easier to read than the human being who had been sitting in front of him. Outside in the parking lot, Halden sat in the cab of his Chevrolet. He didn't start the engine. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the silver watch. He held it in both hands. The chain looped loose between his fingers. The morning sun was higher now, warming the dashboard through the windshield. A sparrow landed on the hood of the truck and looked at him through the glass. He could smell the vinyl of the old seats and the faint trace of the lavender hand cream Mira used to keep in the glove box. He had never cleaned it out. The bottle was still in there, half empty, the cap cracked. The lavender had faded into something almost not there at all. But if he closed his eyes and breathed in slow, he could still find it. "Well, Mira," he said. His voice was quiet inside the cab. He didn't see past the boots. The old manager would have known. Wynne tried to tell him, I expect. Said he was efficient. Turns out efficient and careful aren't the same thing. The old fellow they had here before, Pete Esquivel, he would have looked at the file the second I sat down. He would have called Wynne over before he answered. Pete knew this town. He knew what it meant when a man wore his Sunday coat to ask for a loan he didn't need. This new fellow doesn't know any of that. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. He turned the watch over in his hands. He ran his thumb along the engraving on the back. To Mira, time is patience. The letters were worn shallow now from 56 years of being held and touched and turned over the way he was turning it over right now. But I've been thinking about what you wanted. The reading hall for the men. I've been carrying that 2 years now. The folder is still on the kitchen table where I left it last spring. I look at it every morning when I'm making the coffee. I think I've waited long enough, Mira. I think it's time. 1.5 million, the way we talked about. And I'm going to put your name on the front door, the way you said I shouldn't. And I'm going to anyway. Because the truth is, the building wouldn't exist without you. And the men who walked through that door ought to know whose idea it was. The sparrow hopped twice and flew off. He put the watch back in his pocket. He started the engine. The truck coughed and turned over. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed south on US 285, back toward the ranch. The fields stretched out on both sides of the highway, flat and pale in the November light, dotted with mesquite, and the silvery tops of the windmills he had been maintaining for half a century. He passed a stretch of 3-strand fence he had set himself in the spring of 1964. The cedar posts gone gray but still standing. He passed the spot where, in the fall of 1978, he had pulled over to help a stranger change a tire and ended up driving the man's pregnant wife 12 miles into Roswell because the contractions had started early. The baby had been a girl. The family had moved to Albuquerque the next year. He thought about them sometimes when he passed that stretch of road and wondered what had happened to the girl. Nobody knew. That had always been the point. Mira had been an accountant before they married. She had understood money the way Halden understood weather and soil and the patience a herd of cattle demands. She had told him the year the wildcatter came through, 1971, that the lease money the mineral company was offering for the southern 800 acres was going to keep coming for a long time, and that they were not going to spend any of it. They were going to put every dollar into a trust and let it grow and use it for one thing only, something that mattered after they were gone. He had agreed. He always agreed with her. She had always been smarter about money than he was, and they had both known it from the start. She had grown up in a household where her father had run a small dry goods store in Carlsbad and gone broke twice before he died. And she had decided as a teenager that whatever she ended up doing with her life, she was going to understand money the way her father had not. She had kept ledgers for the ranch from the day they were married. She had read the tax code the way other women in town read magazines. She had told him once that money was just stored time, and that the question was always what you spent the time on. Educational note: the Permian Basin and its northwestern extension into the Pecos River Valley produced a long, quiet wave of oil and gas royalty income for ranching families across southeastern New Mexico from the 1960s onward. Most of those families continued to ranch, drive old trucks, and live in the same houses because the cultural ethic of the region and the unspoken code among neighbors discouraged any visible display of mineral rights wealth. The result was a generation of millionaires who looked, dressed, and spoke exactly like the working stockmen they had always been, and who often quietly funded community projects without ever attaching their names to them until the very end. Part 5. The town begins to remember. By Monday afternoon, the story had traveled. Wynn had not spoken a word of it. She didn't need to. The other customer at the far desk that Saturday morning, a woman named B. Freeman, who had been filling out a deposit slip, had seen Preston Marlowe stand up in his office with the blood draining out of his face. She had seen the screen of Wynn's monitor turned at an angle she did not understand. She had walked out of the bank without finishing her deposit. By Sunday afternoon, every pew in the First Baptist Church had heard some version of what had happened. By Monday morning, it had reached the Dunes Cafe, the post office, the feed store, and the front porches up and down Main Street. The details shifted with each telling. Some said the trust held $20 million. Others said $50. One version had Preston Marlowe on his knees in the lobby. None of them were accurate. All of them carried the same hard center. The old rancher was rich, and the new banker had made a fool of himself. Lorna heard it for the first time from a man named Ed Roybal, who had stopped in for coffee around 7 on Monday morning. She heard it the second time from her dishwasher. She heard it the third time from a teacher coming in for breakfast before school. By the end of the morning rush, she had heard 4 different versions, all of them mentioning Halden Vesper by name. She stood behind the counter when the rush ended. She looked at the third stool from the end, his stool. She thought about 16 years of $2 eggs and $3 tips. She thought about the envelope under her back door the year Tomas died, and the way she had always suspected and never asked. Something turned in her chest. She still didn't know what to call it. That evening, after the dinner crowd thinned out, 2 older women sat in the corner booth and Lorna brought them coffee. She heard them quietly. Remember the year the school bus broke down for good? 79. The county said they couldn't replace it. We had kids walking 3 miles. New bus showed up that September, anonymous, title transferred through a lawyer in Carlsbad. The other woman shook her head slowly. And when Father Aguilar needed the new roof on the parish hall in 82, came out of nowhere, same lawyer. They looked at each other. Lorna stood behind the counter, the coffee pot still in her hand, very still. 5 years earlier, her son had needed surgery on his eyes. The bills had come faster than she could pay them. She had been working 2 shifts, sleeping 4 hours, falling behind. Then one afternoon, the hospital billing office had called and told her the account was 0. Every charge paid in full. Anonymous donor. She had spent 5 years wondering. She looked at the empty third stool from the end. The $3 tip on a $2 breakfast. The quiet man who carried his dead wife's silver watch in his shirt pocket. Her eyes burned. She still wasn't sure. But something underneath her was already sure. At the bank, Preston Marlowe had arrived at 7:30 on Monday morning, an hour before anyone else. He had unlocked his office and pulled up Halden Vesper's full customer profile, the one he should have opened on Saturday. Everything was there. The Vesper Family Trust, the mineral rights royalty deposits, quarterly, going back to 1971, the licensing fees from a chute design manufacturer in Amarillo. Wynn had flagged it in the internal notes years ago. Priority client. Consult head teller before any decline. He had never read the notes. He had been there 6 weeks, and he had never bothered to open the file. At 10, Wynn knocked on his door. She did not sit down. "I want to tell you about Halden Vesper," she said, "and I need you to listen." Marcus nodded. Then he caught himself. "I'm sorry. Yes. I have been at this bank since before you were born. I was here when Halden and Mira opened that trust in 1973. I watched Mira come in every quarter with the lease check. Sometimes she'd put $50 in cash from the side, sometimes $500, whatever the ranch hadn't needed that month. I watched it grow from nothing to what you saw on Saturday. Halden Vesper has not missed a tax payment in 51 years. He has never bounced a check. He has never asked for a favor he did not earn. He is the most reliable customer this bank has ever had. And on Saturday morning, you looked at his boots and decided he wasn't worth your time. Preston didn't speak. Sometimes the richest man in town is the one nobody notices. That is what happened here. I know, Preston said quietly. I know. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I am telling you so you understand. Halden did not come in here to embarrass you. That is not who he is. He came in to see what kind of man you were. He has a decision to make and he needed to know. What decision? That is not for me to say. She walked out and closed the door behind her. Preston sat in his office for a long time after that. He thought about his father, a mechanic in a small town in northern New Mexico. Gray work shirts with the name Marlowe stitched on the pocket. A pickup that smelled of gear oil and cigarettes. As a teenager, Preston had been embarrassed by his father. He had walked different routes home from school so his friends wouldn't see the shop. He had never let his father pick him up at the front door. His father had never said a word about it. He had just kept working, kept paying the tuition, kept showing up every morning at 6. Preston hadn't thought about that in years. That night he called his wife from the small apartment the bank had rented for him above the feed store. He could hear their boy laughing somewhere behind her. "How was your day?" she asked. "I made a bad mistake." He told her everything. The old rancher, the loan request, the denial, the $8 million on the screen, what Wynn had said in his office. His wife was quiet when he finished. "What are you going to do about it, Preston?" "I don't know yet." "Figure it out, because it sounds like you owe that man more than an apology." He hung up and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. Through the window, he could see Main Street, empty and still under the sodium lights. A single dog crossing under the lamp at the corner. The town was so quiet he could hear the wind moving in the cottonwoods along the river. 600 miles north, in a third-floor apartment in Denver, Ardith Vesper sat at her kitchen table at 10 on a Monday night surrounded by paperwork she had been avoiding for weeks. A divorce filing she hadn't signed. A letter from her firm about the project she had been quietly removed from in October. She was 44. She had left Roswell at 18 and never really come back. College, an engineering degree, 20 years of designing concrete bridges across the Mountain West. A marriage that had stopped speaking in actual sentences sometime around her 38th birthday. She had not been home in 2.5 years, not since her mother's funeral. The truth was simple. She had spent 26 years building a life designed to prove she was more than a rancher's daughter. And now that the life was coming apart in her hands, she could not bring herself to call the one person who would have helped without asking a single question. Her phone rang. The display said W. Castellanos. She picked it up. "Ardith," Wynn said. "Your father walked into the bank on Saturday and you need to know what he did." Ardith listened. She did not interrupt. When Wynn finished, Ardith sat for a long moment with the phone pressed against her ear and her eyes on the dark window of her kitchen. "There's more," Wynn said. "He is starting the reading hall. The one your mother wanted. $1.5 million. He is going to put her name on the door." Ardith closed her eyes. "He promised her," Wynn said, "before she passed." "I know. I was there." "Then come home, honey." Ardith hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour without moving. Then she stood up and walked into the bedroom and pulled a suitcase out of the closet. Educational note. The pattern of estrangement Ardith experienced was extraordinarily common among the children of post-war Western ranching families. The economic forces of the 1970s and 80s drew the young towards cities and salaried professions, and the cultural gap that opened between them and their parents was rarely bridged through ordinary conversation. Many adult children spent decades performing a version of themselves that they believed their parents could not understand, while the parents, having watched their children leave and not press them to stay, quietly carried their own grief without ever mentioning it. The cost was generational, and the reconciliation, when it came, almost always came through the death of one parent and an unfinished promise made to the other. Part 6. The Reading Hall and the Watch Ardith pulled up to the ranch house on Wednesday afternoon. Her father was on the porch with a folder of plans spread across his knees and a pencil behind his ear. He looked up when she stepped out of the rental car. He didn't stand. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at her. "You came," he said. "I came." She walked up the steps and sat down in Mira's chair beside him. They sat that way for a long time, both of them looking out across the dry winter pasture toward the line of cottonwoods along the river. Neither of them spoke. The light was the long, low light of November in the high desert, and the wind moved in the dead grass. "How long can you stay?" he asked. "As long as you need me." He nodded slowly. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask about her husband. He didn't ask about her work. He just put his hand briefly on her hand and then took it away and went back to looking at the pasture. On Thursday morning, Halden drove into Roswell and walked into the bank. He went directly to Preston Marlowe's office. Preston stood up when he saw him. "Mr. Vesper, please, come in." Halden sat. He put both hands on his knees. "My wife and I set aside a trust before she got sick. $1.5 million of it is going to build a reading hall in town. A place for the older men, especially the ones who came back from Korea and Vietnam and never quite came all the way back. The lawyer who has been handling our affairs retired last month. I need a banker to administer the disbursement over the next 2 years. About 20 payments to contractors, a half dozen reimbursements to my daughter who will be managing the build, and a final transfer for the endowment fund that will keep the building going after I'm gone." He paused. "I came in Saturday to see what kind of man you were. You showed me. I'm choosing you anyway." Preston Marlowe looked at him. "Sir, don't say anything. Listen, I am not giving you this because you earned it. I am giving you this because the only way you're going to earn it is by doing it. 22 months of writing checks for a building you didn't decide to build in a town that knows what you did Saturday. By the time it opens, you will have either earned the right to stand in that building or you will have left town. Either way, you will know something about yourself that you didn't know last week. That is the offer." Preston Marlowe sat very still. Then he stood up. He extended his hand across the desk. "I accept." Halden shook his hand once and walked out. The building went up over the next 22 months. Frank Holcomb from the hardware store coordinated the contractors. Ardith managed the construction schedule. Preston wrote the checks. Some weeks he came out to the building site at 4 in the afternoon and helped carry lumber off the trucks before driving home to the apartment above the feed store. His wife and son moved down from Albuquerque in the spring of 1987. They rented a small adobe on the south end of town. The boy started kindergarten at the elementary school the following fall. The town did not warm to Preston quickly, but it warmed slowly, the way a desert warms slowly in the spring. By the time the building was finished, most people on Main Street would nod to him. The opening was on a cold, bright Saturday in October of 1988. The sky was the same deep, clean blue it had been on the morning Halden walked into the bank 2 years before. The plaque above the front door read, "Mira Vesper Memorial Reading Hall." Below it, in smaller letters, were the words she had used the last week of her life. "A quiet place is sometimes the loudest gift." Men came in from across Chaves County, veterans from Carlsbad and Artesia and Tatum, old ranchers and old mechanics and old school teachers. Lorna had set up coffee in the back room. Frank had built the bookshelves himself. Halden walked through the building slowly, his hand on Ardith's elbow. Preston was at the front door, shaking hands, introducing himself. His son ran past him with 2 other children and disappeared into the reading room. In the late afternoon, when the crowd had thinned, Halden found Preston in the back hallway. He held out his hand. Preston took it. Not the quick, polished handshake of a man who had learned shaking hands from a book. A real grip. "You did the work," Halden said. "You let me." That's how it goes. Halden drove home alone that evening. Ardith was staying in town for dinner with Lorna and her son, who had come down from Santa Fe for the opening. The road south was empty. The field stretched out flat and pale on both sides, the soil dark and waiting for winter. He drove past the windmill on the south pasture, the one with the new cooling fan and radiator he had installed himself a year and a half ago. Using a check he had written out of the everyday account he had finally allowed himself to keep over $1,000 in. He turned onto the ranch road. The house came into view in the last light. White paint, green shutters, Mira's garden out front covered for winter. The porch chairs empty side by side. He parked. He climbed out. He stood in the yard for a moment, the way he always did, and listened. A dog was barking far off, maybe a mile away at the Robles' place. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods behind the house. He walked up the porch steps. He stopped at the front door and reached into his shirt pocket. The silver watch, the wire-thin chain, The engraving he had paid for on a winter afternoon in 1948. He held it in both hands for a long moment. He had carried it every day for 2 years and 10 months. Through the bank, through the office, through the long Sunday afternoons at the kitchen table sketching room layouts, through every walk around the building site, through every check Preston Marlowe had written, through every conversation he had not had with his daughter, and then finally had. He opened the door. He walked into the kitchen. He set the watch down on the table next to Mira's empty chair, not in a drawer, not put away, just placed gently down in the spot where she used to sit, her arithmetic textbook closed beside her elbow, her coffee cup still warm. The kitchen was quiet. The house was quiet. But the quiet was different now. Not empty, just still. The good kind of still. He put the kettle on. He sat down at the table and looked out the window at the dark field. Same field he had looked at for 55 years. He picked up his coffee when it was ready and held it in both hands. The warmth felt good. He did not say anything to Mira tonight. He did not need to. She already knew. Educational note. The closing gesture of laying down an object carried for years after a loved one's death is recognized in grief psychology as a marker of integration rather than forgetting. It signals that the bereaved person has internalized the relationship and no longer needs the external token to keep the bond present. In rural communities of the American Southwest, where outward expressions of mourning have historically been understated, these private rituals, the laying down of a watch, the closing of a folder of plans, the first quiet evening alone in a finished room, have long served as the real markers of healing, occurring not at the funeral but years later, in the privacy of a kitchen at dusk, when the promise has finally been kept.